Alright, ladies and gentlemen, can everybody see the screen? I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the historic uses of the Ozark Chinquapin. And I want to let you know, first of all, that where I come from, I'm a biologist, but I've spent enough time looking at plants and looking at animals, and I start realizing there are some interesting things that people do with plants and animals, and that's part of their story. And we've also done some things where you offer a class on botany, identifying plants. You might get 10, 15 people that show up. Then there are times when you do something on here's how people use those plants and animals, and you can get 40 or 50 people to show up. So I'm the type of guy that really likes to fuse history along with botany or ecology and see what we can figure out. So with that, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the different uses of the Ozark Chinquapin tree. Most of what I have learned has just been from being someone who reads everything I can get. If it says the word Chinquapin, I want to see what it says. And so I will find some very obscure things in very obscure places, and then I want to dig down and go even deeper and see what else I can find out. Well, here are some of the things that I have discovered are historic and one prehistoric use of the Ozark Chinquapin tree. You can see that the leaves have been used as a cough medicine. And that's a story that we've archived on the website. A gentleman named Mr. Ruark, he said that his kids' lives were saved from the whooping cough by having Chinquapin tea given to them several days in a row. And I have made tea with this and put a little lemon in there, and I can't complain. I think it's a good tea. It's got a little different flavor to it. I will recommend, if you're going to boil this in something you care about that is not stainless steel, you're probably going to have a ring around whatever you boil it in. This stains exceptionally well, which goes into some of the other uses. The bark and the inner bark can be used to make a dye material. First off, I found several references to people using the inner bark of the Chinquapin tree to dye a color of purple. And that was something I really wanted to learn more about. What would it take? Now, I also found references to the American chestnut providing a kind of a brown dye, and then that was applied to the Chinquapin. So I had to find out. I'm just one of those guys, I'm curious. Now I got to know, how is this possible? How do you do that? How do we get that? And so Steve Bost had been up to one of our test plots, and he did have to trim off some limbs. They had to come down for maintenance. I really wouldn't want to sacrifice any bark on a Chinquapin tree from a living tree, and you do have to use a living tree. You can't use a tree that's been down for 5 years. That bark doesn't have any juice left in it that's going to be worth or value. You can do dyeing, you can also do tanning. The whole idea of the word tanning comes from tannic acid. Tanning and tannic acid go together, and Ozark Chinquapins have a lot of tannic acid in their bark, in their leaves, and in their burrs. Ironically, they don't have a lot of it in the nuts. The nuts are very pleasant to eat. They don't make you sick when you eat them raw. That's not the way it works with acorns, which have a lot of tannic acid in them as well. Oaks were also used for the same purpose. Now the wood. The wood has been used for fine furniture. It has been used for fine instruments. I've got a few things to show you with that. I do have one prehistoric use here. It has to do with a spear thrower, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And then finally, the burrs. Now, anybody who's ever picked up a burr will tell you what use is there other than protection for that nut. Well, there is a little bit of use on that because I have found out that you can do some dye work with it, and you can use it for fertilizer. And I do see a lot of historic interviews where people say, yeah, we used to take the burrs and we put it in the garden. They use that for a fertilizer, which I thought was kind of interesting. Okay, so let's take a look at some of this stuff. Alright, so I am part educator, and I have found show is a whole lot better than tell. So I've told you some stuff, but I'm going to show you. And in fact, I'm going to pass some of this stuff around so that you can check it out and see it for yourself. And if we don't get it around the room before the presentation's over, that's fine. It's going to be over here on this table. Some of you have already been looking at some of that. And also, I've got some things to demonstrate. You notice these two racks. I can demonstrate some of that as well. And the reason I have those for demonstrations, I'm also an educator. And as an educator, anytime you get somebody engaged in something, they retain information better. If I just talk to you for the next 30 minutes, you're going to remember about 10% of what I say. But if I let you touch things, see things, and really get engaged with what's going on, you'll remember anywhere from 50 on up to 80% of what goes on today. And that's a really good thing. I want you to remember this stuff. So as a guy who's big into history, this was kind of a natural fit for me. Now, I do want to premise some of this because it's kind of funny to me. I'm big into making long bows. And I really wanted to make one out of Ozark Chinquapin wood. I did a lot of research. There's no indication that they did, or anybody did, Ozark Chinquapin bows that weren't backed. That's the way it was with American chestnut. If you're going to make an American chestnut bow, you need to glue a piece of hickory on the back, a piece of rawhide, something like that. Backing makes it stronger. Chestnut wood doesn't deal well with the stresses of being stretched, but it does great with the stresses of being compressed. Well, I figured since the two trees are related, I'm going to make a bow. And I really wanted a piece of wood. To do that, I'm going to put a piece of hickory on the back. I didn't want to take a rare piece of wood, try to make a self bow, and then watch it explode. So I asked and I begged for a piece of wood about 6 feet tall, about anywhere from 4 inches wide. That's what I wanted to do. I'm a bow maker. I like to make bows. Do you see a bow up here with me today? No. And it's because I got that piece of wood and I knew what I was going to do to that piece of wood. I will take a hatchet and I will start hacking off pieces of wood until I get something that, looking at it from the front view, looks like a bow. And then I'm going to get on there with my hatchet, my draw knife, and I'm going to start hacking some more, and there's going to be wood chips all over the yard. It looks like a lightning bolt hit a tree and all the carnage is left in the yard. And I started thinking about this poor Chinquapin wood that I really don't want to waste a single scrap of. So I got to thinking about, I think I'm going to use a table saw. And I'm going to saw out what I need, and I'm going to make that bow. As it turns out, that is the last piece of wood I have to work on. And it's still in my basement, and it'll probably come to the next meeting. But what I did in between is going to be what I talk about here. I just really got into this stuff. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about fences. How many of you have heard about Ozark Chinquapin wood being used as a fence post? All right. It is a rock-resistant wood. It lasts for a very long time. It is a strong wood. So first off, before anybody was ever putting wire between fences, they were making split rail fences like what you see up here. And you have to keep in mind, Ozarkers at that time, they were not trying to fence cattle in, or sheep in, or whatever livestock you had. They were trying to fence the livestock out. Because they weren't going to do a huge pasture full of fence. That's a lot of work, and you have to replace that every 10 or 15 years with oak and hickory and things of that nature. So when they did a fence, it was around their garden. It was around their yard. It was to keep the cows and the pigs out of the areas that had the plants they cared about. Also, anybody who's ever dug in the Ozarks knows if you're going to dig, you're going to hit rocks. So if you want to make a fence that's easy to put around, split rail fence is nice. But eventually people did start using barbed wire, and they realized that if they're going to do that, they are better off to use some type of wood like black locust, Osage orange, or Ozark Chinquapin. And one of our members, Chris White, he's done some research on newspaper articles. Anything that says the word Chinquapin in it, you'd be surprised how many times someone offers to sell Chinquapin wood for fence posts. Somebody's already done the work and they're just selling them for whatever per stave. Kind of neat. Okay, so I got that log and I really wanted to do something with it, and then I read about some more of this dyeing. And I thought, man, I want to try that. Now, everything I had seen said that the inner bark was what they used. I don't want to go kill Ozark Chinquapin, because if you start taking bark off, that's very bad. And even if I took very little, that makes it at risk for getting blight. I couldn't do that. But we had to trim some limbs on a plot. I got the limbs. I started scraping all the bark off. Filled a huge cook pot. Not my wife's, my pot. My pot. And I let that soak for a week, and I scoured, which is a fancy term for I cleaned the cotton, and I got it to the point where it would receive the dye. And I did the same thing. I cleaned the wool. I didn't have to scour it. And I got those ready. Now, one thing that you can do to promote dye absorbing into anything, whether it's cotton, especially cotton, or wool, is soak it in some kind of tannic acid. Now, as I said before, Ozark Chinquapins have lots of tannic acid. So I can take the burrs, put them in a pot, soak them for a while, put my handkerchiefs, my towels, my wool, I put it in there, and I am getting that ready to go to absorb the dye. Works great. Alright, so after I got that soaked, I got a nice boil going. And I say a nice boil, I mean a gentle boil. I don't mean a rolling big bubbles coming up. I'm talking about those little effervescent bubbles like you have when you pour your soda. So at that point, I've got nice warm wet wool, nice warm wet cotton, and I put it in the dye bath, and immediately I started to see it change colors to a tan. I sprinkled in a little bit of alum, and that helps to set the color. And I wasn't real impressed, and it wasn't purple, so I was disappointed. But I found out there's two other modifiers people used. Now a modifier is something you put into a dye bath that takes the color, it helps to cinch it to the fibers, but it changes the color slightly or dramatically. So I used some copper. I had old copper wire, I had some copper pipes, pieces, and I put that into a solution, let that sit for a couple weeks, and it was ready by the time I boiled all this, and I poured that in there, and all of a sudden, I ended up with this green color, kind of an olive drab. I went, ooh, we're getting somewhere. Alright, so I had another batch, and I had some iron, old rusty nails that I put in a solution. I poured that in, and I got this purplish gray coming out of there. Now at the time, this was darker purple, but it's lost a little bit, and I think that has to do with the fact this is the first thing I've ever dyed in my life. I'm reading books, I'm reading on the internet, and I am not an expert. Certainly not at that time anyways. I've learned a lot more, and I've gotten better at it, which I'll show you in a bit. So I was able to at least say, okay, this is definitely possible. They definitely did make purple out of Ozark Chinquapin dye, or I'm sorry, out of bark. But it just kept nagging me. Man, I don't want to use that bark. Well, then it occurred to me, well, people used to dye things with hickory leaves and hickory bark. Osage orange, they would use the bark, they would use the wood, they would use the fruit. And they would get slightly different colors, and a light bulb went off. Ooh, 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 I've got access to trees, I've got leaves, I've got burrs, and that is a renewable resource that does not hurt the tree. So, I started boiling more stuff. And yes, my wife knew what I was doing. She did expect a clean, unsmelly kitchen after we were done. So I did that, and this is talking about the modifiers just a little bit. And you can see the pots look kind of gross. Don't use the pots you cook in. First of all, you'll be found out. Number two, I can't imagine that's good for your food. You can see that purple was just a little bit darker, but you can see the alum, the copper, and the iron. Those are the things that really help to fix the color on the fibers. Now what I decided to do was weave something with that. And this is the process called finger weaving because I don't use a loom. I hang this from something, either a nail up on a tree or up on the porch, or that little drying rack. I can sit on the porch, I can do this in the living room, I can do it in the hotel room, and I weave. And I used a series of different colors. I had some Osage orange, I had some hickory color, walnut color, and I started making a chevron design. Now, rather than do this right here, right now, I think what I'm going to do is, after I'm done presenting and whenever we have a break, I'm going to gravitate up there, and anybody who wants to see what it takes to finger weave, I'm happy to show you. If you want to know more about the process, I've got that on the Ozark Chinquapin Foundation website. And I've got references to books that I use to learn how to do this. I love to read. I read on the internet. I read books. This is a great way for me to get into stuff. I find experts. I pick their brain. I ask them lots of questions. Okay. I want you to notice that the cotton did not turn out the same. I've got two pieces here. You notice that one of them is green and the other one is essentially brown. Cotton and wool do not behave the same when it comes to dye. So if you want something specific, sometimes you have to be willing to settle. I wasn't going to get a green on that. It just didn't happen. Even though they came out of the same dye bath, cotton does not behave the way wool does. So that works out a particular way. Had several of those, given several to the educators, people who do programs about the tree. Eventually we may do the same thing with people who are teachers in school who want to teach about the tree. I did another bath with Burs about the time those started coming out, and I want you to notice something. I didn't get a green. Lo and behold, I actually got a brown. I got a brown. Just like they said for the American chestnut. Furthermore, I want you to notice here was the first batch with the bark. Here's the Burs with the iron. These were both treated the same way. One's with Burs, one's with the inner bark. Now I'm starting to suspect, At this point, I might have gotten the bark at the wrong time. There wasn't a lot of juice in them in January. So someday, when there's enough limbs that need to be cut, I want to try it again, and hopefully they come from a time period during spring or summer when there's a lot of sap in there, because that's when you really get a lot of the dye stuff. By the way, if you're going to do this with burrs, filter the burr water and don't keep the burrs in there with all of your dye stuff. That would be really bad. You're trying to finger weave those little spines sticking in there. It's just not a good deal. So use a strainer, and a strainer that you don't use for spaghetti. Ask me how I know that. I did a little dye work with leaves, and I got an even darker purple and an even darker brown. And then just the one with the alum, I thought was much darker than what the bark provided. So everything on this table was all done with the Ozark Chinquapin. Now I have some dye stuff up there on the stage. Those are from different plants. But look at the variety of what I was able to do with 2 color modifiers and different parts of the plant. And that's actually what you would expect from oaks, hickories, ash, any other type of tree. You're going to get slightly different colors from different plant parts. Kind of cool. So the application here, you have to keep in mind that somebody who grows up in the 1800s in the Ozarks, they don't buy a lot of fabric with fancy colors. They had to make their own colors. So the Ozark Chinquapin tree was a known source to get a brown or a purple. If you wanted a different color, choose a different plant. And it was that simple, and it worked very well for them. Here's some things that I have learned about the dyeing. First off, talk about the copper and the wool. You can get dye from any of the parts. I like to recommend that you take the leaves right before they're about to senesce and drop off. You still have a lot of the chemicals in the leaves. They're still pretty fresh, but you're not going to do a lot of damage to the tree. Time of year does matter. I think if I had harvested the bark earlier, I would have gotten a little darker purple. Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. I do also know that when I did the bark, we had so much rain, all I had to do was put a bucket out under the gutter, and I was going to collect all the rainwater I could possibly use. Now the pH on that is different than my well water. Now, did that help change the color? Very possible. You can change pH, and you can get a gradual shift from something to something else. So I think that that's something I need to look into. Don't do a rolling boil. What you'll end up doing is breaking apart the chemicals you're trying to use to dye. So if you're going to let it simmer, make sure it's at a low temperature. And then after you're done, take it out and put it on the porch. Or outside, somewhere where it's not going to be messed with. And let it sit overnight. Just let that dye soak up. And here's the deal. If you really want a dark, rich color, whether it's bright or dull, have a whole bunch of material in there. I put more leaves in there than I thought I needed. I put more burrs in there than I thought I needed. And that really helps. So if you want to walk in those footsteps, get that recipe off the webpage. By all means, follow my footsteps. Tell me if you learned something. But those are some things that I would offer up as food for thought. Makes things work a whole lot better. I also use alum, which I purchased from a dye making shop. But then I turned around and I used alum and cream of tartar. I thought it was going to do the exact same thing. It does not. It changes pH. So yes, it does affix the dye to the fibers, but it changed the pH. So really what I'm telling you is I'm an alchemist. Okay, I'm going to talk about the instruments. Here's a quote from Robert Barnes. He told this to Steve in 2008. Wood produces beautiful furniture and musical instruments. Even today, things made from Chinquapin wood is highly prized. Robert Barnes. I'm still trying to find more and more of these instruments historically, and a few of them are starting to pop up through our Facebook file. And what I have found is that the wood on the Ozark Chinquapin starts out really light colored, and then with age it gets much darker. And right now, if you look at the dulcimer that I have here today, or some of these that are photographed, it's got a beautiful grain. It's beautiful wood. And I've seen some references to furniture. In fact, there was one newspaper article that said that somebody donated a bunch of Chinquapin wood to make a case for all the trophies a school was winning. So that tells you how much they thought of Chinquapin wood to build a trophy case out of it. It's kind of the way we look at walnut today. Before I made a dulcimer, I started with chestnut. I found a guy who was refurbishing old barns. He would get pieces of chestnut. I wanted to see how it worked. I wanted to see how it sounded. So I made a couple of these, and at that point I felt like, okay, I'm ready to tackle this piece of Ozark Chinquapin that I've gotten. So here's what I did. Well, let me back up. I do want to note that in the Foxfire book, they do mention that chestnut and walnut makes a very nice presentation, both visually and acoustically. So I thought, well, I'm going to do what they did. These Appalachian guys do their stuff. I wasn't getting a whole lot of information from the Ozarks. I'd love to get more. And I thought, all right, I'm going to do it that way. I'm going to make a top out of Chinquapin, and the rest of it's going to be walnut. And that actually worked out very well. I took 3 pieces. Normally this is done with what's called a book matching. I won't get into the details of it, but I used 3 pieces instead of 2. And I made what I thought was going to work for a top. It took me about a year to get all of that squared away. I started out by getting the frame made out of walnut. I ended up firming that up with some reinforcing pieces around the inside. Allows you to have better gluing. Here's what that looks like from the top. And then I glued the bottom on. I did book matching with that one. It kind of looks like butterfly wings. You cut 2 pieces and then you fold them out and glue them together right there at that thin margin where they meet. Then after getting that all squared away, I got my top. It was planed down like it needed to be. And it was ready to go. You can see by looking at that, I've sanded it down. It looks pretty sharp. I had to cut in sound holes, which I chose black bears because they eat Chinquapins. They like Chinquapins. I also glued on the fretboard, and the next thing you know, I've got this thing assembled. And folks, this was a lot of work. Now, as I started reading about what the Ozark pioneers did, for their frets, they would use wires and form them into staples. Instead of having a mechanical gear head that they would crank to tighten the string, they would have something that they would jam in there, and they would use friction. And then once that was taken care of, they jam it in there a little tighter. Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot imagine what it's like to use hand tools exclusively to make a dulcimer the way those Ozark pioneers did. And apparently they would just make 1 or 2, enough for them, or maybe one of their family members to have, and they never really made a bunch. They didn't go into business. They were just making something so they could break up the lonely, long years and weeks and nights in the Ozarks. And I thought that was kind of fascinating. So here it is finished, and I did bring it. It is strung, it is tuned. I would love to tell you that I'm a musician and I would love to play it for you, but other than strumming it, it's ready for somebody who has talent. I was hoping that Donna and Kelly were going to be here, and then they would be the ones to play it. And that would be kind of a neat deal, a neat treat for me to hear it being played. But here's the neat thing about this. When people see the dulcimer, the first question they ask me besides, do you play, is, what's that wood? And what do I get to say? Well, that's Ozark Chinquapin wood. Really? What's that? I've never heard of that. And I get to start talking about it. This becomes an interpretive tool for me. I can start talking about that because now they're interested. I'm not boring them about the tree. I've got them engaged. They think it's pretty neat. And I hope you've had a chance to come up and check that out. All right? So, here's prehistoric use. Atlatls. There is a group of places in southwest Missouri and northwest Arkansas called the Bluff Dweller Sites. And in these Bluff Dweller Sites, they have found a lot of artifacts. 2 of them of interest to me. One is this spear thrower with pegs, with a peg on them. And archaeologists got to looking at that and said, you know, the way this is preserved, the way it looks so good, and all the other wooden artifacts look terrible, I think that's Ozark Chinquapin wood. So he started doing a little scratching on that. He found a sprout. He made an atlatl. He compared the 2 and said, yep, this is Ozark Chinquapin wood. He also found a piece that, I'm going to hold this. I want you to notice where my forefinger is. Everything from there down was broken off. But he found all of this up here, minus the leather, which had rotted away. And there was no string or sinew or anything like that. And it was labeled as a ceremonial object. Now that's kind of a joke with a lot of archaeologists, because what that really means is, we have no idea what it does. Okay, so he got to looking at this, and I want you to notice, and I'll point this out up on the slide, see what this looks like without the loops on there? This is identical to this. That's the side view, and that's the top view. Now, the good news is, they had spear throwers in the desert southwest that looked just like this. And they had so many of them that they had them in different assemblages. In other words, different degrees of decomposition and decay and destruction. So that he was able to say, I know exactly how this looked. So he was able to say, this is what you need to do to make that happen. Well, I looked at that and said, well, heck, I can pull that off. And I had all these pieces left over from making the bow and making the dulcimer top, and I thought, these are too small to do anything else with, I'm going to make some spear throwers. And what's going to happen when someone does a spear thrower program with this? What's Ozark Chinquapin wood? I'm glad you asked. Let me tell you more about that. So let me get that passed around. Folks can take a look at it. Now, spear throwers, I can go into a program on that. I'm not going to. They throw 6-foot-long spears, and they were used to bring home the bacon before bows. Very effective. I still ended up with lots of little pieces of wood that I could not use for bows or dulcimers, and I thought, you know what, this is where I'm going to go off the rails a little bit. I can't prove to you this is a historic use of the Ozark Chinquapin, but I can tell you this, I know people. And if you've got a piece of wood and you've got a project you need done, and that's sitting there, you're going to use it. And that's exactly what I did. I made these weaving shuttles. Now, that's for making that net that's on the bigger rack over there. And again, I'm happy to show everybody what I'm doing. But here's how I use that. If I go to the Cape Nature Center and I say on Saturday from 2 o'clock to 4, I'm going to teach people how to make nets, I just set up in the hallway. I don't go to a classroom. I stand in the hallway and people come in, hey folks, how you doing? And if they slow down, I say, hey, y'all want to help make a net? And they look at you like, what? Well, come on over, let me show you. And I'll do 2 or 3 knots, and the next thing you know, I've got them doing it. And then they start looking at the wood for the gauge stick and the shuttle, and you know what they say? What's this wood? And then what do? I talk about the Ozark Chinquapin. So it's fun stuff for me. Made that net with the items that you see photographed there. Got these up here, they're small. You have to show you. I have made the Chinquapin tea. You do need to be willing to have just a little bit of stuff in your tea. Like the old days when you had to read tea leaves. You're going to get a little bit of that if you do homemade. Alright, so kind of wrapping this up. I have learned that there's some new things to do. I want to tan a hide with Chinquapin tannic acid. I've got a hide that has been scraped of all of its fat. I've got a hide that's been scraped of all of its hair. I need to collect enough bark or burrs or leaves or whatever has all the tannic acid. Or if I'd been thinking, I would have saved all those wood shavings from the planer. That would have been perfect. And yet I put that in the compost pile. But I still think I have enough. I can tan a hide using this. I want to do some experiments with pH. I want to maybe think about doing a violin, seeing what parts can be used. I still want to learn more about what the Ozarkers used the Ozark Chinquapin for. What part of a banjo? What part of a violin? What else? Because I don't know, and I'd love to learn. There's lots of things we don't know about the wood. Maybe it would make a wooden longbow. I don't know. We would know if we know more about the density, the tensile strength, and a lot of other properties. But it takes a lot of samples of wood to do that. And I'm not willing to sacrifice live, precious trees to do that. We're not ready for that yet. But there's lots to learn. Here's the thing. As I do this program, I'm trying to convince you that the Ozark Chinquapin tree has historic value. But it's not just historic. If we restore this tree, do you realize that any one of you in this room could do everything I just did? Now, think about that. In fact, I posted a picture of that dulcimer on Facebook. Somebody said, how much do they sell those for? You don't understand. That's priceless. There's no way I would sell that dulcimer. I'm not going to. But one day, just one day, we might have a whole shop full of Ozark Chinquapin dulcimers because of what we've done, restoring this tree, getting it back on the landscape. And I think that's a pretty exciting idea. The nut's valuable. If you've eaten them, everybody's eaten a nut now. They taste great. They're great raw, they're great cooked. They have valuable wood. It's rot resistant, it's beautiful. You can make amazing things with it. You can even do stuff with the bark and the leaves. And ladies and gentlemen, surprising as it may be, you can still use the burrs and they have a value. But if you have pricked your finger or your foot on the burrs, I'm not going to argue with you if you decide to say dead gum burrs are worthless. I get it. Now here's one thing that I will say, and I want to make sure this is real plain. Yeah, I've gone through this whole list of historic uses. And in a way, I'm saying, see, we can use it. It's worthwhile, right? But let me put it to you like this. If I had given everybody in this room a pop quiz beforehand, what's the uses of the Ozark Chinquapin, how many of you would have said anything close to this list? Was the tree still valuable? I say yes, because we've lost a lot of knowledge about what some of these plants and animals are worth to us, and we don't fully understand what they're worth just to the ecology of the Ozarks. So what I would argue to you, in a polite manner, is that the Ozark Chinquapin tree is worth saving because it exists. But what makes it a real easy sale is all of this stuff about the nuts, the wood, the bark, the leaves, and the burrs. And with that, I'm going to end my presentation, take some questions. After I'm done, I will move a lot of this gear back over there so you can examine it. During a break, I will be over here demonstrating how to use the nets, or how the weavers are used, and then also the finger weaving. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you all for your time and your attention. Nobody fell asleep. I love that. Any questions?
I've got a question.
Okay. Yes, sir. Okay, the nutrient value. You're asking a marvelous question. And the answer to that is we don't know exactly. Yeah, that's a great question. For the fact that people did it and then it worked, there must be something in there that's valuable, but I can't tell you if they're adding crude protein to the soil, or what is it? I have no idea.
Probably like adding corn cobs to clay soil helps break it up the soil.
Helps to break it up. Everybody hear that? He's saying corn cobs would be added to soil to help break the soil up.
Did they chop up the burrs?
You know, that's a good question too. I don't think I've ever asked any of the people when they say they use the burrs for fertilizer. It didn't occur to me to ask, so how'd you do that? I figured they were just digging a hole and putting them in, or digging a trench and putting them in there. I should have asked. That's a good question.
Okay, I bet they pounded them and smashed them and chopped them
I
up.
wonder about that.
Did they say specifically that they were using it as fertilizer, or that they were putting it in the garden? Because if they were putting it in the garden, it might have been to deter animals.
They said specifically for fertilizer.
They did say that, okay.
But, you know, that's another question I could have followed up with. Now, was there any other purpose to putting it in the garden? See, that's the thing. You don't know what people know until you ask, and you are asking really good questions. And see, that's the kind of stuff that I don't want to lose, because right now, the people that know all this are 80 years and older. Neat stuff. Yes, sir.
Oh, some of the question, another thing that's going to use chicken bird fertilizer, first place to use them on chicken.
Yeah.
That's where they naturally fail. I mean, they have to do that pretty.
It's the same nutrients that they need, yeah. I can see that.
Because they say, I run across, you know, people fertilize them, so you do, that might be a good fertilizer.
Yeah. He's suggesting that the burrs would be a good fertilizer for Chinquapin trees, since they already have what Chinquapin trees need and use. Good point. So as these items are going around, just make sure they get back up here. And again, I'm going to take those over there and make sure everybody gets an opportunity to see anything you want to see on that. Now, as far as the dye process, that's on the website. I have a couple of articles in waiting. I've given those to Leslie. And keep in mind, a lot of the work that we do on Facebook and on the web, that's done by volunteers. So sometimes we get busy with our lives, and then we have to put Chinquapin projects kind of on the back burner unless it's just burning, in which case it takes a while. So eventually we'll get the dulcimer stuff up there, but as I do more and more of these historical things, I'm putting those on the website, and I like them because it does connect us to the past, and it gives you a reason, okay, I want to do some of that. I'd like to make that available. All right, with that, any other questions before I turn it over to Steve? Man, y'all are great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Before you go away, it's that time again where we do Ozark Chinquapin trivia. And so do you have a question based on what you did that you would like to see if anybody's got a good answer for it? I'll look for hands, see whoever hits a hand
I'm
up
going to give you a softball pitch. What's the chemical in the Ozark Chinquapin tree that's used to preserve leather? Right there's first hand I saw. Right. He's right. He's on.
Very good.